So now let's talk about the various different normal forms. So first is first normal form. And in this normal form, the data is to be atomic, which means that there are no data separated by commas. Now, what this would look like if the data were separated by commas is you'd have a column and there would be items inside of that column simply separated by commas. Let's say you had an employee table that you had, maybe an employee ID, but in the actual employee name column, you had multiple different employee names separated by commas. Okay, that's not normalized. The problem that it causes there is you really are going to have a difficult time, especially when you're trying to add new employees or anything like that. It's going to be very difficult for you to account for them in your database. So you would think that the best way to do that is to separate those repeating employee names by multiple different column groups, right? The reason why you don't want to do that is because the same issue would happen. It would be very, very difficult to account for employees who you're bringing in. So let's say in one column you had 3 employees that were separated by columns. And then let's say you decided that you wanted to not separated by columns separated by commas. Let's say you wanted to split those, and then all of a sudden each employee has their own column. Okay, that would not be correct either, because like I mentioned, it would be too difficult to really account for new employees coming in. Where would you put them, right? So it also tends to cause data inconsistency, because let's say you need to actually make some changes to an employee. Okay, it's possible that you could be changing it in a place where you may change it one place, but then another place it may get missed. So that's why it's important to not put any data separated by commas or any repeating column groups. And simply repeating column groups is, let's say you have one employee, you call it employee 1, then employee 2, and then employee 3, and so on. Well, that's repeating data, right? And we don't want data redundancy either, right? So the last thing would be to identify each record uniquely using the primary key. Now, majority of tables tend to already do this, and the things that we really need to pay attention to are simply the first 2 rules of not being separated by commas and having no repeating column groups. So let us go over to SQL Server right now to see how this all works out. So the first thing that I wanted to show you guys with this is my first statement of a lot of database tables are already in first normal form. Let's take a look at the person table that I created from last video. And let's go ahead and select top 1000 rows. Okay, so we can see here in my table that I have 10 names, first name, last name, and I also have an ID. Okay, this is first normal form because we have a primary key. There are no repeating column groups, and there's no repeating data. Okay, and we also don't have anything separated by commas. Everything is atomic. So everything is set to one thing here. So what I mean by that is atomic simply means one column has everything that it needs. So first name only has one name in each row. Last name only has one name in each row. And simply what atomic means is each row has one specific name. Okay, so we do not have any kind of duplication here. Okay, so this normally is usually already the case in a lot of different tables. Okay, so this is the first thing that I wanted to show you guys. Normally, first normal form is usually already taking place. Now, there are some databases that are not, and so they have to do quite a bit of, I wouldn't say quite a bit of work, but they'd have to do some work to ensure that it gets into first normal form. Now, this can happen kind of like I was mentioning in part one's video, where there can be a transfer of data over from another data system. They're transferring data to a relational database model. And in that previous place where they kept the data, there may not have been a primary key or anything really to identify it in order to have the proper table structure. So that's one of the ways that first normal form may not already be inside of a table structure. But in most cases today, usually we already have first normal form available in a lot of tables, especially if you have been taught from the beginning to utilize a primary key. Now, we did see earlier this semester how to add those in. So definitely, that's something that you want to ensure happens. So just a quick reminder of the rules of first normal form is this. We have one primary key for each record in the table. Each record is atomic. That means one row has one specific name. There are no duplications of rows. And there's also no duplications of columns or data being separated by commas here. Okay, so everything is clean and right for first normal form here. Okay, so that is our first normal form example. Okay, now I don't want to spend too much time trying to take a table and put it into first normal form, because as I mentioned, we pretty much have seen throughout the semester tables being in first normal form. What I really want to get into are tables that are needing to go to the next normalization form, which is second normal form and third normal form. So that's what we will see next. So second normal form basically says this. When a table needs to be, or a database needs to be in second normal form, here's what needs to happen. It must adopt the rules of first normal form. So we already talked about what first normal form was. Must have a primary key, no repeating items in the columns or inside of the rows. And then also too, we know that we want to ensure that every single row, okay, is identified by a brand new ID. So there's no repetitive data or no repetitive words, no repetitive items that come up, okay? Now, with second normal form, we want to adopt the rules of first normal form, but next, we also want to make sure we move any repeating data to a new table and create a relationship using foreign keys. Now, we've kind of already been using foreign keys, but I really want to show you guys the importance right here of using foreign keys. Sometimes it can be difficult to know when certain tables need to utilize foreign keys. And so that's where second normal form comes in. Now, we've kind of already been taking a look at creating relationships since earlier this semester. But here in second normal form in the SQL Server database, I'm going to show you just briefly how you can actually take a table and put it in second normal form. All right, so I have a database called company, and my company database right now consists of an employee table because I want to keep track of all the employees in my company. Well, this simple table only holds 3 employees so far, but here is how we can tell that this is not in second normal form. Okay, so we know we have a primary key, which right here is employee ID, and we know that we have 1 employee per row, so we're not repeating any values or anything like that. So each employee is on its unique line, so we don't have Mary, Stephen, or Kevin repeating, okay? So that identifies by first normal form. However, here is the where the issue is right here, okay? So we have department name, department head, department location. We do have some data redundancy here, okay? So the problem is we have IT and the department head Edward and the department location repeating twice, okay? This tends to happen a lot, as I said, when data can get transported from other systems. And so that's why we have to be very, very careful as to what we decide to put in these tables. Now, no matter who leaves the company, okay, no matter which employees leave the company or come into the company, usually the department head stays the same. Okay, it's very rare that the department head changes. Okay, we know for sure that there will always be an IT or HR department, and more than likely, the location of the countries will not change either. Okay, I think the only thing that would probably make that change is depending on who the department head itself is and where they live. Okay, but truthfully, okay, these 3 things normally will not change based on whether or not somebody comes into the company. Okay, so remember that I mentioned one rule of second normal form is that we must move repeating data to another table in order to have the correct relationship for these tables and for this data. Okay, so earlier this semester, we talked about how to do primary and foreign keys. But now this explains why we actually need foreign keys. Okay, so we learned before the importance of having them and how they actually relate in the database. This tells us why we need them, is because sometimes when data is transported from other systems and finally gets into a relational database model, we tend to have this happen here. Okay? So what you would need to do is you would need to break off this repeating data into another table to ensure that we don't have any data inconsistencies. Because let's say we decided that we weren't going to do that, right? Well, if the department head Edward changes, then someone would have to remember to change Edward not only in this record, but in this record as well. So that can really cause data inconsistency because if you forget to change it in one place, then it really won't be accurate, right? So that's the importance of creating tables with foreign keys so that no matter what, if someone changed inside of the department head, only one place would need to be changed. So let me go ahead and break off this repeating data into another table to show you guys how that works. So in order to help ensure Second normal form, the first thing that I did was to ensure that this employee table definitely indicated employee ID as a primary key. One common mistake that a lot of people tend to make with databases is just because their ID, their column has an ID, they believe that that's the primary key already. But unless your database indicates that but it's PK, which indicates it's a primary key, then you will not truly have a primary key. So you want to make sure that you do that. If not, then your table will not be able to become part of the normal forms that it needs to be in. Okay. So remember that when you're doing second normal form, the tables must apply the first normal form rules first. All right. So we took care of one of those, which is creating a primary key. Okay, we already have distinct columns. We do not have any items with commas in their data, and we don't have any repeating columns. Okay, so we've already kind of taken care of those aspects, but we need to go ahead and take care of this data redundancy, which is now getting this into second normal form and creating our primary keys. So let's do that now, or not primary keys, but creating our foreign keys. So let's do that now. So I went ahead and I added in the department table, okay? And before I move on to the next step of trying to modify this table, I want to answer a question that some people may have. Well, Miss Corley, in this sample example, there are only 3 records. How would you really know how many departments there are? Okay, or how many department heads exactly a company has, because there can be 50,000 employees and 12 different departments. How would you really know, especially if you said that sometimes what happens with data is it gets transferred over to SQL Server and it's not even really in the right forms yet? Here's one tip on how to do that. So what you would want to do is you'd want to utilize your ability to sort the columns. So whenever you are trying to figure out, okay, how many actual departments do I even have in order to really try to put those inside of my department table here? In a real actual company database, we wouldn't just have 2 departments. That's true. So what you would do is you would take advantage of your sort option. And the way that you would take advantage of that is you would say, use your order by statement, and then the column that you're wanting to order by, which in this case is department name, and then you would say ASC or DESC, depending on if you want it in ascending or descending order. That is the easiest way to be able to tell how many departments you have. Now, I recognize that there can be many, many records, but if you're really wanting to know how many departments you have, you can sort them by that, okay? And you can also say, you can even utilize the select distinct method as well, especially if you know you've got some repeating data that may actually repeat values for different employees. So you could even use the select distinct statement as well to help you be able to see how many actual departments there are. So those are just a couple of tips on how you can actually see how many departments you have so that you know in your department table what you actually need to include. Okay, so now that we have our department table set up, what we needed to do was, of course, we needed to take care of our primary key. So what we did over here is we added in our primary key for the department table. Remember that in order for something to be in first normal form, it's got to have a primary key. And so once we took care of all of the first normal form rules, we now modified our employee table to include the department ID, which is going to be referenced back to the department table. So here what we did was we altered our employee table to include the department ID, okay? And then what we did was we said, okay, now we want to reference that department ID to the department ID in the department table that we've created here. Okay, so let's see the output of our employee table now before we make the appropriate changes to complete our second normal form. Okay, so as you can see here, my department ID is null. And the reason why is because we do not actually have any data in here. So once you add a department ID in order to create it as a foreign key, you want to ensure that you add the appropriate ID so that when you create a query and you actually join those together, you'll actually be able to see that those apply. So here's what we are going to do. So just for time purposes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and edit these top 100 rows, and I'm going to add in the department ID that it pertains to. So IT is 1. Let's take a look at that. IT is 1 and HR is 2. So we are going to add in the correct department numbers here. And then once a new employee comes in, all we have to do is indicate which department ID that it is. Okay, so once we've done that, okay, let's go back and execute this. Okay, and we have the appropriate ones. Now, once I go ahead and I drop these tables and I clear out this information, okay, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys just kind of in a query how this would actually now relate to each other so you can see how these apply and how the data is actually working out in this form. Okay, so now that we have properly separated our table, I have gone into the employee table and dropped all the necessary columns that we have needed to drop. Okay, so you're probably wondering, okay, does that take away some of the data? Well, actually, no, it doesn't, because now we have referenced that data in a different table. So now we don't have to worry about having these columns in the employee table anymore. So let's go ahead and see now what that table looks like. So now we have the employee, we have the employee name, employee ID, employee name, gender, salary, and which department they are in, but it is indicated by an ID now. And so now if we would decide to do a query, that would give us the employee name and what department they were in, we can easily be able to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that as an example just to show you that our table is now properly in the second normal form utilizing foreign keys. All right, so I just did this query to show you that we have officially put it in a second normal form. So what I did was I did a query to select all employees to show their employee name and their department name, and I interjoined on the department, and then I said, when I interjoined on the department, I interjoined on the department ID. So now that we have done that, in our results of our query, it properly shows up as the right department name. Okay, so that is how you get your table into second normal form. And again, there's no need to worry about any data that's being dropped if you dropped those duplicate columns from the original table. Once you have now accounted for all of the departments and you've put them all inside of the table appropriately, then you are able to properly account for that. So just know that if you were to add a new department, it would now be easy because then you would have an appropriately marked department specifically for that particular department. And you don't have to worry so much about changing the data in multiple places, which is not efficient anyway. So then if let's say you want to now change your department head, well, let's say if Edward left and Bobby replaced him, well, now all we'd have to do is change Edward to Bobby here. And then when we did our query, Bobby would show up. Bobby would show up if let's say we added in the actual department head's name. So let's add in the department head. So department head. And then now when we execute the query, if Bobby were to replace Edward, Bobby would show up here in Edward's spots. Okay, so as opposed to the first table we had where we wouldn't have been able to really change that because let's say you had over 40,000 employees in a major company. Well, that would be all tons of records that you'd have to change if Mr. Edward were to leave the IT department. So that's why it is important to put our tables in second normal form. And as you're taking a look at this, you're probably thinking, well, I have seen that before. Yes, you probably just didn't realize that doing things like separating redundant tables or separating redundant table and putting them in separating redundant data, and putting them into tables or utilizing foreign keys are actually rules for second normal form. So now let's get into third normal form and see what that entails. So here are the rules of third normal form. The first requirement is that it must meet the conditions of first normal form and second normal form. So I hope that now you're getting the idea and understanding that the further you go down in the normal forms, you have to have met the previous conditions of the previous forms. And that's just how it works. Now, I will venture out to say that there are actually 6 different normal forms. It is just that most databases are in third normal form, so that's where we're going to stop today. Now, once the conditions of first normal form and second normal form are met, then the columns cannot contain they cannot contain any situations where they're not fully dependent on the primary key. So we can't have any columns that are not fully dependent on the primary key. So let's go back to SQL Server, and I want to give you guys another example and show you exactly what that means. Okay, so here is an example of how we want to get something to be in third normal form. So let's say that for some reason the company decides that they want to start tracking annual salary, or maybe they're wanting to, create a specific report that indicates everyone's salary, right? And of course, this report would not go outside of the company for confidential purposes. But let's say maybe for auditing purposes or something like that, a report needed to be created in order to get everyone's annual salary, right? So I want to introduce you guys to something called computed columns in SQL Server. This is a really good time to show you this. So right here, I have annual salary, and you can see here on the left that annual salary is a computed column with the money data type. And what we have utilized to do so is we have a statement that says add annual salary as salary times 12. Okay. So if you wanted to, you could create a computed column. Okay. The only thing that sometimes happens with computed columns is this. What can cause a problem here is these columns may not be fully dependent on the primary key only, which we know is a rule of third normal form. So here's what I mean by that. Let's say, let's say Mary gets a promotion and now her salary has changed to, I don't know, 7,000 per month instead of 5,500. Well, then this annual salary is of course going to change, but it's not fully dependent on the primary key because it's also dependent on the salary. Okay. So how can we fix that? Okay. More than likely, here's what I have seen done in industry. So normally the way that you can actually fix this is you could simply drop this table from the employee table because really it's not necessarily needed. Okay. You can easily on a reports, especially if you're doing SQL reports, you can easily do this on a report itself. Okay. Or what you can do is you can even compute this in a query. Okay, so you can actually do this in a query as well. So usually when you're writing reports, you would utilize queries anyway. Okay, so and when we get to the SQL reports lesson, I will talk all about that. But this actually is kind of is not needed. And so you can definitely delete this. Now, if for some reason it has to be in the database for an absolute reason, then the company would kind of work with the IT department to figure out, okay, how can we actually put this in the database where it's still not violating any normal form rules. Okay. So the best way in this case would simply be to just delete this annual salary. And that's simply because, as well, it can be picked up anywhere else. It can be picked up in a query and it can also be picked up on a SQL report. But we want to ensure to include something in third normal form. We want to ensure that every column is dependent only on the primary key. So in this situation with the annual salary, it's also dependent on salary, which is not good. Okay, so we want to ensure that it's dependent on the primary key only. Okay, we know that salary is dependent on the primary key only because if somebody changed, let's say if somebody left, okay, well then, you know, obviously this would be different, you know, because they've now left. But they also would probably keep this just on record because you normally don't want to delete anything from the database to in order to keep a record. Okay. But if somebody were to leave or somebody were to get a promotion, then of course this would definitely be affected by the primary key. In this case, with the annual salary, it's not fully dependent because it's also dependent on the salary too. So the thing that you just have to be careful with computed columns is to ensure that you have a situation where you are not going to violate any normal forms. And again, that really just depends on the normal form rules. And as I mentioned before, there are 6 normal forms. Most companies go to third normal form because they feel that's clean enough for their database to operate. Now, if you've got major databases, some companies will go all the way to 6. So, but just know that the further you go, the stricter the rules get. Okay, so we're going to stop at third normal form for this class. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and drop this annual salary table just to ensure you guys that it is in third normal form compliancy. Okay, I have now dropped that annual salary table and it is now back in third normal form compliance. So I know that was a brief example for that particular normal form, but we really just want to ensure that we don't have any columns that are not fully dependent on the primary key itself. And as I mentioned before, if you want to do a computed column, just ensure that it does not violate any normalization rules. So what can I say to sum this up? To really sum up normalization, you just want to make sure that not only is your data not redundant, that it's not inconsistent, and that it has no anomalies or incorrect data, but utilize the normal forms in order to help you do that. And really, when you stick with the normalization rules, you can ensure that your database is as clean as possible. So I hope that this gave you a great understanding of the first, second, and third normal forms. Feel free to look into the other three normal forms. We're going to stop here with the third normal forms, as this is normally where most companies will stop their normalization process. But again, really the decision to go further than that, as I mentioned in part one of this video, is really dependent upon the company and the things that are involved. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next lesson.